Behind the towering iron gates of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal tradition stand guard like silent sentinels, a single moment in the early hours of a winter morning would shatter the carefully maintained facade of dignified royal life forever. What happens when a prince, stripped of his military honors and royal duties, decides that locked gates and armed guards cannot keep him from what he believes is rightfully his? What drives a man who once wore the uniform of his nation with pride to become the very threat those uniforms now stand ready to defend against? This is not just another tabloid scandal or whispered palace rumor. This is the true account of 3 minutes and 47 seconds that exposed the raw desperation lurking beneath royal privilege, the moment when Prince Andrew's world collapsed so completely that he chose to risk everything, and perhaps his life, in a desperate gamble to force his way back into a castle that no longer welcomed him. The security cameras captured it all. The guards' radio chatter tells the real story. And for the first time, the complete truth emerges about the night that forever changed how the British people see their royal family. Some secrets are too explosive to stay buried. Some falls from grace are too dramatic to ignore. And some truths are too dangerous to remain hidden behind palace walls. This is that truth. The winter night wrapped around Windsor Castle like a burial shroud, thick and impenetrable. At precisely 3:17 in the morning, the silence that had settled over the ancient stones was broken by the aggressive roar of a Range Rover's engine echoing through the empty streets of the small Berkshire town. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Matthews of Thames Valley Police had been dreading this call for months. Her secure radio crackled to life as she sat in her unmarked patrol car, monitoring the quiet streets that surrounded the royal residence. The voice on the other end belonged to Sergeant William Hayes, the senior officer responsible for coordinating security between the local police and the Royal Protection Unit. Control to DCI Matthews. We have a Code 7 situation developing at the Henry VIII Gate. Subject identified as Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Vehicle registration confirmed. Is demanding immediate entry and becoming increasingly agitated with security personnel. Matthews felt her stomach drop. Code 7 meant a member of the royal family was creating a potential security incident. In 32 years of police service, she had never encountered anything quite like this. She had dealt with drunk celebrities, entitled politicians, and even minor royals behaving badly. But this was different. This was a senior member of the House of Windsor, someone who had once represented the crown with distinction, now apparently having some kind of breakdown at the gates of his childhood home. Copy that, Control. What's the current threat assessment? Matthews responded. Already starting her engine and turning toward the castle. Unknown at this time. The Duke appears to be alone, but he's refusing to leave and is making threats about forcing entry. Palace security is requesting immediate backup. The duty sergeant says he's never seen anything like this. As Matthews drove through the empty streets, her mind raced through the implications. Prince Andrew had been effectively exiled from royal duties following the scandal surrounding his association with Jeffrey Epstein and the subsequent disastrous BBC interview that had made him a pariah in his own family. The civil lawsuit that followed had cost him his military titles, his royal patronages, and apparently his access to the family properties he had once called home. But this wasn't just about a family dispute. This was about national security, about the carefully maintained image of the British monarchy, and about a man who seemed to be spiraling completely out of control. The Henry VIII Gate came into view and Matthews could immediately see the problem. The black Range Rover was positioned at an aggressive angle across the entrance, its engine still running, hazard lights flashing like an amber warning beacon in the darkness. Through the ornate iron bars of the gate, she could see at least 6 uniformed royal protection officers maintaining a defensive position, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. Prince Andrew stood outside his vehicle, still wearing what appeared to be a dinner jacket from some formal event earlier in the evening, though it was now disheveled and stained. His usually perfectly groomed appearance was in complete disarray. His hair was wild, his tie askew, and there was something in his posture that spoke of desperation rather than the entitled arrogance she had expected. Matthews approached cautiously, her trained eyes taking in every detail. The Duke was gesticulating wildly, his voice carrying across the night air in angry bursts that echoed off the castle walls. She could make out fragments of his words, phrases like "my father's house" and "you work for me" mixed with language that would have made a sailor blush. The senior royal protection officer, a man Matthews recognized as Inspector David Coleman, noticed her approach and walked over to brief her on the situation. Coleman was a veteran of 25 years in royal security, a man who had protected everyone from Princess Diana to the current king, and the strain on his face told Matthews everything she needed to know about how serious this had become. "Ma'am, he arrived approximately 40 minutes ago," Coleman explained in a low voice. keeping his eyes on Prince Andrew throughout their conversation. Initially, he was relatively calm, just requesting entry. When we explained that he wasn't on the approved visitor list and that protocol required advance clearance, especially at this hour, he became increasingly hostile. "What's his current state?" Matthews asked, noting how the Duke was now pacing back and forth in front of his vehicle like a caged animal. "Alcohol appears to be a factor, but he's not incapacitated. His speech is slurred, but he's coherent enough to know exactly what he's doing. The real concern is his escalating behavior. He's made several references to forcing his way past us, and 20 minutes ago he got back in his vehicle and appeared to be considering ramming the gate." Matthews felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. The gates of Windsor Castle weren't just decorative barriers. They were reinforced security installations designed to stop everything from terrorist attacks to exactly this kind of incident. If Prince Andrew actually attempted to ram them with his vehicle, the result would be catastrophic for everyone involved. "Has anyone attempted to contact other members of the royal family?" she asked. Coleman nodded grimly. "We've been in contact with the palace. The king has been informed, but the official word is that this is to be handled as a standard security incident. No family members will be coming to intervene. We're on our own with this one." The message was clear. Prince Andrew had finally crossed a line that even blood relationship couldn't excuse. His own family was washing their hands of him, leaving him to face the consequences of his actions without the protection that royal privilege had always provided. As if sensing their discussion about him, Prince Andrew suddenly turned and strode directly toward them. His face was flushed with anger and alcohol, his eyes wild with something that looked dangerously close to panic. "You!" he shouted, pointing directly at Matthews. "I know who you are. You're the senior police officer here. I demand that you order these men to open these gates immediately. I am Prince Andrew, Duke of York, and this is my family's home. I have every right to be here." Matthews had dealt with enough intoxicated individuals to recognize the signs of someone who was beyond rational reasoning. But she also understood that her response in the next few minutes could determine whether the situation ended peacefully or became a national crisis. "Your Royal Highness," she began, keeping her voice calm and professional. "I understand your frustration, but I'm sure you're aware that even members of the royal family must follow security protocols, especially during overnight hours. Perhaps we could arrange for you to speak with someone from the palace in the morning, when appropriate arrangements can be made." Prince Andrew's face darkened further. "Security protocols? Security protocols? Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I served in the Falklands War. I flew combat missions for this country. I've given more for the crown than you could possibly understand. And now you're telling me that I need permission to enter my own father's house?" The pain in his voice was unmistakable, cutting through the anger and alcohol to reveal something far more troubling. This wasn't just the tantrum of an entitled royal. This was the breakdown of a man who had lost everything that defined him, who was clinging desperately to the last symbols of a life that no longer existed. But understanding his pain didn't change the reality of the situation. Matthews had a job to do, and that job was to ensure that this incident didn't escalate into something that could endanger lives or further damage the already strained relationship between the royal family and the British public.
"Sir, I need you to understand that continuing this behavior will only make your situation worse,"
she said firmly. "The best thing you can do right now is to return to your vehicle, drive home safely, and address this matter through appropriate channels in the morning." Prince Andrew stared at her for a long moment, and Matthews could see the internal battle playing out across his features. Part of him seemed to recognize the wisdom of her words, but another part, the part driven by desperation and wounded pride, was pushing him toward actions that could destroy whatever remained of his reputation and freedom. "Appropriate channels," he repeated, his voice dripping with bitter sarcasm. "The same appropriate channels that stripped me of my military titles? The same appropriate channels that banned me from representing the crown? The same appropriate channels that turned my own family against me?" He turned away from her and walked back toward his vehicle. But instead of getting in, he opened the driver's door and reached inside. Matthews tensed, her hand instinctively moving toward her radio, ready to call for armed backup if necessary. Prince Andrew emerged from the vehicle holding what appeared to be a bottle of whiskey, already half empty. He unscrewed the cap and took a long drink, then turned back to face the assembled security personnel with a look that chilled Matthews to the bone. "You want to see what happens when a prince has nothing left to lose?" he called out, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made every officer present shift uncomfortably. "You're about to find out." The next few seconds would prove to be among the most tense in the long history of Windsor Castle, as everyone present realized that they were no longer dealing with a family dispute or even a security incident. They were witnessing the complete collapse of a man who had once been third in line to the throne, and no one could predict what he might do next. Matthews knew that she was running out of time and options. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would either end this crisis peacefully or transform it into something far more dangerous. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket as she prepared for what might be the most challenging negotiation of her career. The silence that followed Prince Andrew's ominous declaration seemed to stretch on forever, broken only by the distant sound of additional police vehicles approaching through the night. The cavalry was coming, but Matthews wondered if it would arrive in time to prevent whatever the Duke was planning to do next. As she studied his face in the amber glow of the streetlight, she realized that she was looking at a man who believed he had absolutely nothing left to lose. And in her experience, those were always the most dangerous people of all. The arrival of 3 additional police vehicles transformed the quiet street into a scene that resembled a military operation, more than a domestic incident. Blue lights strobed against the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle, creating an almost surreal atmosphere that seemed to mock the centuries of dignified history that had played out within those walls. Detective Chief Inspector Matthews watched as Prince Andrew took another drink from his bottle, his eyes tracking the new arrivals with a mixture of defiance and something that might have been fear. She knew that the increased police presence could either de-escalate the situation by demonstrating the seriousness of his actions, or it could push him further over the edge by making him feel cornered and desperate. Sergeant Hayes approached her position, speaking in a low voice that wouldn't carry to where the Duke stood swaying slightly beside his vehicle. "Ma'am, we've got 12 officers on scene now, plus the 6 Royal Protection personnel. Armed response unit is 15 minutes out if we need them. The palace has also sent word that they want this resolved quietly if at all possible." Matthews nodded, understanding the unspoken message. The royal family wanted this incident contained before it could become another public relations disaster. The last thing they needed was footage of Prince Andrew being arrested or forcibly removed from the castle gates, appearing on every news channel and social media platform in the world. "What about his personal protection officer?" she asked. "Surely he still has some level of security detail." Hayes shook his head grimly. "That was revoked 6 months ago along with his other privileges. According to our intelligence, he's been completely cut off from official support systems. No security, no staff, no access to royal residences without prior approval. He's essentially been cast out completely." The implications of that information sent a chill through Matthews. A man who had lived his entire life surrounded by privilege and protection, suddenly finding himself completely alone and abandoned by his own family, could be capable of almost anything. The psychological impact of such a dramatic fall from grace could drive even the most stable person to desperate measures. Prince Andrew seemed to sense their discussion about him and turned his attention back to the assembled officers. His movements were becoming more erratic, and Matthews noticed that his free hand was clenched into a fist at his side. The combination of alcohol, humiliation, and desperation was creating a volatile cocktail that could explode at any moment. "I can hear you whispering about me," he called out, his voice slurring slightly but still carrying the authoritative tone that decades of royal training had ingrained in him. "Planning your little strategy, are you? Trying to figure out how to handle the embarrassing prince who won't go quietly into exile?" He took another drink and then suddenly hurled the bottle against the castle gates with tremendous force. The glass exploded in a shower of amber liquid and glittering shards that caught the streetlight like falling stars. The sound echoed off the stone walls like a gunshot, causing several officers to instinctively reach for their weapons. 43 years I've served this family," Prince Andrew shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. 43 years of duty, of sacrifice, of representing the crown with dignity and honor. And this is how they repay me? Locked out like a common criminal, treated like I'm some kind of threat to the very institution I've devoted my life to protecting? Matthews could see tears streaming down his face now, mixing with the perspiration that had formed despite the cold night air. This wasn't just anger anymore. This was raw grief, the desperate howl of a man who had lost everything that gave his life meaning and purpose. Inspector Coleman approached her position, his radio crackling with updates from the security command center inside the castle. "Ma'am, we've got movement inside the grounds. The Night Watch has reported that lights are coming on in several windows. Word is spreading that something's happening out here." That was exactly what Matthews had been afraid of. If members of the royal family started gathering at windows to observe the spectacle, or worse, if someone decided to intervene personally, this situation could spiral completely out of control. The last thing they needed was Prince Andrew's ex-wife or his daughters attempting to mediate, potentially putting themselves in danger. "Any word on media monitoring?" she asked, knowing that in the age of social media and 24-hour news cycles, keeping something like this secret would be nearly impossible. "So far, we've been lucky. It's 3:30 in the morning, and this street is normally completely deserted. But we've got unmarked units positioned at both ends of the road to prevent unauthorized access. The problem is going to be the helicopter routes. If any news choppers start flying over, this whole thing goes public immediately. Prince Andrew had begun pacing again, but his movements were becoming increasingly unstable. Matthews realized that the alcohol was affecting him more severely than she had initially assessed. Combined with what appeared to be extreme emotional distress, he was becoming a danger to himself as much as to anyone else. "Your Royal Highness," she called out, deciding that direct engagement was now her only option. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You're not well right now, and continuing down this path is only going to make things worse for you. Let us help you get home safely, and we can work on resolving this situation properly in the morning." Prince Andrew stopped pacing and fixed her with a stare that was both lucid and terrifying. "Help me? You want to help me? Where was all this help when the vultures were circling? Where was this concern for my well-being when my own family threw me to the wolves to protect their precious institution?" He gestured wildly toward the castle, nearly losing his balance in the process. "Do you see those windows up there? Those are the rooms where I grew up, where I played as a child, where I dreamed of serving my country with honor. My father died in there in that castle, and I wasn't even allowed to be at his bedside because it might create bad publicity for the new king." Matthews felt a stab of sympathy despite herself. Whatever Prince Andrew had done to deserve his exile from the royal family, the human cost of that punishment was becoming tragically clear. But sympathy wouldn't resolve this crisis, and she could see that his emotional state was deteriorating rapidly. "Sir, I understand that you're in pain right now, but pain," Prince Andrew interrupted, his voice rising to almost a shriek. "You think this is about pain? This is about justice. This is about a family that built their reputation on the backs of people like me, who served without question, who sacrificed everything for duty and honor, and then discarded us the moment we became inconvenient." He suddenly strode back to his vehicle, and Matthews tensed, ready to signal for immediate intervention if he appeared to be preparing to ram the gates. Instead, he reached into the passenger seat and pulled out what appeared to be a military service medal, holding it up so that everyone could see it in the streetlight. "Do you know what this is?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "This is the South Atlantic Medal. I earned this flying helicopters in a war zone, while most people my age were partying at university. I risked my life for this country, for this crown, for these people who now treat me like I'm some kind of monster." He held the medal for a moment longer, then suddenly hurled it at the castle gates with all his strength. It struck the iron bars with a metallic clang and fell to the ground, where it lay glinting in the artificial light like a fallen star. "There," he said, his voice now barely a whisper. "That's what 43 years of loyal service gets you in this family. A piece of metal that they can't wait for you to throw away yourself." The gesture seemed to drain the last of his manic energy, and Prince Andrew sagged against his vehicle, looking suddenly older and more fragile than his 63 years. Matthews realized that this might be her opportunity to end this crisis before it escalated further. "Your Royal Highness," she said, stepping closer but maintaining a respectful distance, "what you've just shown us, that medal, that represents real service and real sacrifice. No one can take that away from you, no matter what else has happened. But right now you're putting yourself at risk, and I don't think that's what you really want." Prince Andrew looked up at her, and she could see that some of the wildness had gone out of his eyes. The alcohol was still affecting him, and the emotional turmoil was still evident. But he seemed to be listening for the first time since this incident began. "They locked me out," he said simply, like a child who couldn't understand why he was being punished. "My own family locked me out of my father's house. How is that supposed to feel like anything other than complete rejection?" Matthews felt her heart break a little for this broken man, despite everything she knew about the circumstances that had led to his disgrace. "I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you," she said honestly. "But causing a scene like this, putting yourself at risk like this, it's not going to change anything. It's only going to make your situation worse." Prince Andrew was quiet for a long moment, staring at the medal lying on the ground near the gate. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that Matthews had to strain to hear him. "I just wanted to see my father's library one more time," he said. "There's a chair by the window where he used to sit and read the newspapers every morning. I just wanted to sit in that chair and remember what it felt like to be part of something important, something bigger than myself." The simple humanity of that confession hit Matthews harder than all of his earlier threats and dramatics. Here was a man who had lost his way completely, who was clinging to memories of a time when his life had meaning and purpose. She realized that underneath all the entitled behavior and royal arrogance was someone who was fundamentally lost and alone. But even understanding his pain couldn't change the reality of the situation. Prince Andrew was intoxicated, he was behaving erratically, and he was creating a security incident that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. She had to find a way to end this peacefully, but she was running out of options. As if reading her thoughts, Prince Andrew straightened up and looked directly at her with an expression that sent a chill through her blood. "You know what?" he said, his voice suddenly clear and determined. "I think I've been going about this all wrong. You want to keep me out? You want to treat me like I'm some kind of threat? Fine. Let me show you what a real threat looks like." The transformation in Prince Andrew's demeanor was instant and terrifying. The broken, grieving man who had just moments before been confessing his desperate need to connect with his father's memory suddenly straightened up with military precision, his eyes hardening into something cold and calculating that made every officer present shift uncomfortably. Detective Chief Inspector Matthews felt her blood freeze as she recognized the look. She had seen it before in veterans suffering from severe psychological breaks, when years of military training suddenly resurfaced during moments of extreme stress. Prince Andrew wasn't just an entitled royal anymore. He was a man with combat experience who felt he had been pushed beyond his breaking point. "Control. This is DCI Matthews." She spoke quietly into her radio, trying not to provoke any further escalation. "We need that armed response unit here immediately. The situation has just changed dramatically." Prince Andrew began walking slowly around his Range Rover, his movements now deliberate and controlled rather than the erratic stumbling of moments before. It was as if the alcohol had been burned away by whatever decision he had just made, leaving behind something far more dangerous than a drunk and disorderly member of the royal family. "You know what I learned flying combat missions in the Falklands?" he called out, his voice carrying the tone of a military briefing rather than the slurred rambling they had been hearing. "I learned that sometimes you have to take decisive action when conventional approaches fail. Sometimes you have to be willing to sacrifice everything to achieve your objective." Inspector Coleman appeared at Matthew's side, his face pale with concern. "Ma'am, we've got a problem." Intelligence just came through from the palace security office. 3 months ago, Prince Andrew made several inquiries about the structural weaknesses of the castle's perimeter defenses. They thought he was just being nostalgic about childhood games of hide and seek. But now, Matthews felt her stomach drop. If Prince Andrew had specific knowledge about vulnerabilities in the castle's security systems, this situation had just escalated from a family dispute to a potential national security incident. The man they were dealing with wasn't just a disgraced royal with a drinking problem. He was someone with intimate knowledge of the very defenses that were supposed to keep threats exactly like this from succeeding. "What kind of structural weaknesses are we talking about?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "Drainage systems, old tunnels, maintenance access points. The castle is over 900 years old. There are ways in and out that most people don't know about, but someone who grew up there, someone who explored every inch of the place as a child, the implications were staggering. While they had been focused on preventing Prince Andrew from ramming the main gates, he might have been planning something entirely different. The question was whether his current state of mind would allow him to execute such a plan, or whether the alcohol and emotional distress would interfere with any complex strategy. Prince Andrew had completed his circuit of the vehicle and was now standing at the rear, his hands resting on the tailgate. Matthews noticed that his posture had changed completely. Gone was the swaying, unsteady stance of an intoxicated man. He was standing with military bearing, feet shoulder-width apart, spine straight, hands clasped behind his back in the classical position of attention. 43 years of service, he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the night air. 43 years of learning how to assess tactical situations, how to identify weaknesses in enemy defenses, how to exploit those weaknesses to achieve mission objectives. Did you really think a few locked gates and some police officers would be enough to keep me from my objective? Matthews realized that she was no longer dealing with a standard police incident. This had become a military situation, and she was woefully unprepared to handle someone with Prince Andrew's training and knowledge. She needed specialists, people who understood military psychology and tactical thinking. "Your Royal Highness," she called out, trying to keep her voice calm and professional, "I need you to understand that whatever you're planning, it will only make your situation worse. You're a member of the royal family. Even with everything that's happened, you still have options. You still have people who care about you. Don't throw that all away for a moment of anger." Prince Andrew turned to face her, and the smile that crossed his face was unlike anything Matthews had ever seen. It wasn't the expression of an angry drunk or even a desperate man. It was the cold, calculated smile of someone who believed they held all the tactical advantages in a confrontation. "Options?" he repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "People who care about me? Detective Chief Inspector, you clearly don't understand the situation at all. I have been systematically stripped of everything that made me who I am. My military titles, my royal duties, my access to family properties, my security detail, my income, my reputation, and finally my dignity. What exactly do you think I have left to lose? He reached into the back of his Range Rover and pulled out what appeared to be a large duffel bag. Matthews felt her heart rate spike as she realized that whatever he had been planning, it was more elaborate than just showing up drunk and demanding entry. He had come prepared for something specific. Control. We need that armed response unit now. She spoke urgently into her radio. Subject appears to have brought equipment. We're moving to code red status immediately. The response crackled back immediately. Armed units are 3 minutes out. All personnel are to maintain current positions and avoid any actions that might provoke escalation. 3 minutes felt like 3 hours as Matthews watched Prince Andrew unzip the duffel bag and begin removing items that she couldn't quite identify in the dim streetlight. Whatever he was taking out, he was handling each piece with the careful attention of someone who had used similar equipment many times before. Sergeant Hayes moved up beside her, binoculars in hand. Ma'am, I can get a better look at what he's doing. The streetlight is creating shadows. But if I can get to that position, negative, Matthews replied firmly. We don't know what kind of equipment he has in that bag. Moving closer could trigger whatever he's planning. We wait for armed backup and specialist negotiators. But even as she gave that order, Matthews knew they might not have the luxury of waiting. Prince Andrew's movements were becoming more purposeful, and she could see that he was assembling something complex from the various components he had removed from the bag. You know what the real tragedy is? Prince Andrew called out, apparently addressing his remarks to all the assembled officers. I actually believed in the institution I was serving. I believed that the monarchy stood for something meaningful, something worth preserving. I was willing to sacrifice my personal happiness, my relationships, even my safety for that belief. He held up what appeared to be some kind of electronic device, though Matthews couldn't determine its exact nature from her position. But institutions are only as strong as the people who lead them. And when those leaders are willing to sacrifice anyone and everyone to protect their own positions, then the institution becomes nothing more than an elaborate lie. The device in his hands was making some kind of beeping sound, and Matthews realized with growing horror that they might be dealing with something far more serious than a simple break-in attempt. If Prince Andrew had access to military-grade equipment, if his knowledge of the castle's vulnerabilities was as extensive as intelligence suggested, then this incident could have consequences that extended far beyond family drama. Your Royal Highness, she called out, trying to project calm authority despite the fear that was building in her chest. Whatever that device is, I need you to put it down immediately. Let's talk about what you're trying to accomplish here. There has to be a better way to resolve this situation. Prince Andrew looked up from the device, and the expression on his face was almost pitying. Detective Chief Inspector, you still don't understand. This isn't about resolution. This isn't about negotiation or compromise. This is about demonstrating that actions have consequences, even for people who think they're untouchable. The beeping from his device was getting faster, and Matthews realized that whatever he was planning was entering its final phases. She had run out of time for negotiation, out of time for trying to talk him down from whatever desperate action he had decided to take. All units, she spoke into her radio, abandoning any pretense of keeping the situation calm. We are moving to active threat status. Subject appears to be preparing to deploy unknown device. I repeat, unknown device with electronic components. All personnel take defensive positions immediately. The words had barely left her mouth when Prince Andrew suddenly straightened up and looked directly at her with an expression of absolute determination. 43 years of loyal service, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the night air. I think it's time the crown learned what happens when that loyalty is betrayed. He raised the device above his head, and Matthews realized that she was about to witness either the complete breakdown of a member of the royal family or something far more dangerous that could change the course of British history forever. Either way, she knew that nothing would ever be the same after this night. The electronic beeping reached a crescendo, and Prince Andrew's finger moved toward what appeared to be an activation switch. In that moment, Matthews understood that whatever happened next would define not just the rest of Prince Andrew's life, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. Time seemed to slow as she watched his finger descend toward the device, knowing that she was powerless to stop whatever was about to unfold. The weight of history pressed down on her shoulders as she realized that she was witnessing a moment that would be remembered and analyzed for generations to come. The question that would haunt her for the rest of her career was simple. Could she have done anything differently to prevent what was about to happen? But as Prince Andrew's finger reached the activation switch, she realized that some moments in history are inevitable, driven by forces too powerful for any individual to control. The device activated with a sound that would echo in her nightmares for years to come. The sound that emerged from Prince Andrew's device was not the explosive blast that Detective Chief Inspector Matthews had been dreading. Instead, it was a high-pitched electronic whine that seemed to pierce through the night air, like a digital scream. Within seconds, every radio in the vicinity began crackling with static, and the streetlights along the castle perimeter started flickering in an erratic pattern that created an almost strobe-like effect. Matthews felt a mixture of relief and renewed terror as she realized what Prince Andrew had activated. It wasn't a bomb or a weapon in the conventional sense. It was some kind of electronic warfare device designed to disrupt communications and electrical systems. The implications were staggering. If he could knock out the castle's security systems, if he could create enough chaos and confusion, he might actually be able to breach the perimeter using his knowledge of the structural vulnerabilities that intelligence had warned her about. Control. This is DCI Matthews, she spoke urgently into her radio, fighting through the static that was making communication increasingly difficult. We have electronic countermeasures in effect. Repeat. Subject has deployed ECM device. All security systems may be compromised. The response that came back was fragmented and barely intelligible through the interference. But she caught enough to understand that the situation had just escalated to the highest possible threat level. Armed response units, specialist negotiators, and technical support teams were all being deployed. But with communications disrupted, coordinating their response would be nearly impossible. Prince Andrew stood in the center of the chaos he had created, the electronic device still active in his hands, watching the effects of his actions with what appeared to be grim satisfaction. The flickering streetlights cast his face in alternating patterns of light and shadow, giving him an almost demonic appearance that seemed fitting for the nightmare this situation had become. Inspector Coleman appeared at Matthew's side, shouting to be heard over the electronic interference. "Ma'am, we're getting reports from inside the castle that multiple systems are going offline. Security cameras, motion detectors, electronic locks. If this continues, we'll be operating blind." Matthews felt the weight of command pressing down on her like a physical force. She had trained for hostage situations, terrorist attacks, and natural disasters, but nothing had prepared her for dealing with a member of the royal family who apparently had access to military-grade electronic warfare equipment and the knowledge to use it effectively. "How long can that device operate?" she shouted back to Coleman. "Unknown, but probably not indefinitely. The question is whether he has other devices, other phases to whatever plan he's executing." As if he had heard their conversation, Prince Andrew suddenly shut off the electronic device, plunging the area into a silence that seemed even more ominous than the chaos that had preceded it. The streetlights stopped flickering, but the damage to their communication systems was already done. Radio chatter was still fragmented, and Matthews could see that several officers were having trouble with their equipment. "Phase 1 complete," Prince Andrew announced, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. He placed the electronic device carefully back in his duffel bag and pulled out something else that Matthews couldn't quite identify in the uncertain light. "I hope everyone enjoyed that little demonstration of what 43 years of military experience can accomplish when properly motivated." Matthews realized that she was dealing with someone who had clearly planned this operation in advance, someone who was executing what appeared to be a multi-phase assault on the castle's defenses. The question was whether his ultimate goal was simply to gain entry to the property, or if he had something more dramatic in mind. "Your Royal Highness," she called out, hoping that she could still reach whatever rational part of his mind might be functioning. "You've made your point. You've demonstrated that the castle's security systems have vulnerabilities. But continuing down this path will only result in serious criminal charges that will destroy what's left of your reputation and freedom." Prince Andrew looked up from whatever he was assembling from his bag of equipment, and the smile that crossed his face was unlike anything Matthews had ever seen. It wasn't the expression of someone who was acting irrationally or impulsively. It was the cold, calculated smile of someone who had thought through all the consequences of their actions and had decided that the potential benefits outweighed any possible costs. "Criminal charges?" he repeated, his voice carrying a tone of genuine amusement. "Detective Chief Inspector, I think you're still failing to grasp the fundamental nature of this situation. I am Prince Andrew, Duke of York. I am the son of a king and the brother of a king. Do you really think the British justice system is going to prosecute me for trying to enter my own family's property?" The casual confidence in his voice sent a chill through Matthews as she realized that he might be right. The royal family's relationship with the law had always been complicated, and she knew that prosecuting a senior member of the House of Windsor would create political and constitutional complications that no one in government would want to deal with. But even if Prince Andrew was immune from normal legal consequences, that didn't mean his actions wouldn't have other kinds of repercussions. The damage to the monarchy's reputation, The security implications of his demonstration that royal properties could be vulnerable to someone with insider knowledge, the precedent it would set for other disaffected members of the extended royal family, all of these factors could have consequences that extended far beyond this single incident. Prince Andrew had finished assembling whatever device he had been working on, and Matthews could see that it appeared to be some kind of portable cutting torch or welding equipment. Her heart sank as she realized that he was preparing to attack the castle gates directly, using tools that could potentially breach even their reinforced construction. All units defensive positions, she commanded, knowing that they were rapidly approaching the point where this situation would require active intervention regardless of Prince Andrew's royal status. Subject appears to be preparing to attempt forced entry. Arm response units, what's your status? The reply came through broken static, but she could make out enough to understand that the armed units were still several minutes away. Delayed by the communications disruption and the need to coordinate with palace security about rules of engagement when dealing with a member of the royal family, Prince Andrew activated his cutting device, and a brilliant blue flame erupted from its nozzle, casting harsh shadows across the street and illuminating his face with an almost hellish glow. The symbolism was not lost on Matthews, a prince of the realm literally burning his way through the barriers that his own family had erected. You know what the irony is? Prince Andrew called out over the hissing sound of his torch as he approached the castle gates. These gates were installed to keep threats out, to protect the royal family from people who might want to harm them. But they never considered that the greatest threat might come from within the family itself. He touched the flame to the ornate ironwork of the gate, and sparks immediately began flying in all directions. Matthews could see that the metal was already beginning to glow red hot where the torch was making contact. Whatever alloy the gates were made of, it was not designed to withstand this kind of direct attack. This is madness, Inspector Coleman shouted over the noise of the cutting torch. Even if he gets through the gates, the grounds are crawling with armed security. He'll never make it to the castle itself. But Matthews was beginning to understand that Prince Andrew's goal might not be to actually reach the castle building. This entire operation might be designed as a demonstration, a way of showing the world that the royal family's security was not as impregnable as everyone believed. If that was his objective, then he was already succeeding beyond his wildest dreams. The media attention alone would be devastating. Even if they managed to contain the immediate situation, word would inevitably leak out about what had happened here tonight. The image of Prince Andrew using military equipment to burn his way through the gates of Windsor Castle would become one of the defining symbols of the monarchy's decline in the 21st century. Ma'am, Sergeant Hayes appeared at her side, his radio crackling with urgent updates. We've got a problem. Helicopter approaching from the south. Appears to be media. Someone's tipped off the press. Matthews felt her last hope of containing this incident evaporate. Once the media arrived, once cameras started rolling and photographs started being taken, this would become a global news event that would dominate headlines for weeks or months. The damage to the royal family's reputation would be incalculable. Prince Andrew must have heard the approaching helicopter as well, because he suddenly stopped his cutting operation and looked up at the night sky with an expression of satisfaction that chilled Matthews to the bone. This wasn't an unintended consequence of his actions. This was exactly what he had been planning all along. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, projecting his voice so that everyone present could hear him clearly. I do believe we have an audience arriving. How perfect. The whole world is about to witness what happens when the House of Windsor abandons one of its own. He resumed his cutting operation with renewed vigor, the blue flame of his torch sending cascades of sparks across the street like a deadly fireworks display. Matthews realized that she was no longer trying to prevent a security incident. She was trying to prevent a public relations catastrophe that could fundamentally damage the British monarchy's relationship with the people they served. The sound of the approaching helicopter grew louder, and Matthews could see its lights beginning to pierce through the darkness. In a matter of minutes, this scene would be broadcast around the world, analyzed by experts, and dissected by historians. The image of Prince Andrew burning through the gates of his family's castle would become an indelible part of British history. As she watched the sparks fly from his cutting torch, Matthews realized that whatever happened next, the monarchy would never be quite the same. Prince Andrew had succeeded in creating exactly the kind of dramatic spectacle that would force the nation to confront uncomfortable questions about the relevance and sustainability of an institution that had seemed unshakable just hours before. The helicopter was directly overhead now, its searchlight illuminating the entire scene with harsh white light that made everything appear stark and surreal. Prince Andrew looked up at the aircraft and raised his cutting torch in what could only be interpreted as a salute, the blue flame creating a defiant beacon against the night sky. Matthews knew that image would be on every front page in the world by morning, and she wondered if she was witnessing not just the breakdown of one man, but the beginning of the end of the British royal family, as the nation had known it for over 1,000 years. The helicopter's searchlight transformed the scene outside Windsor Castle into a stage where one of the most dramatic moments in modern royal history was about to reach its climax. Detective Chief Inspector Matthews watched in horrified fascination as Prince Andrew continued his methodical assault on the castle gates, each spark from his cutting torch captured in stark detail by the cameras that were undoubtedly recording from above. The ironwork was beginning to buckle under the sustained heat of his military-grade cutting equipment. What had once been an elegant barrier, designed more for ceremony than serious security, was proving no match for someone with Prince Andrew's knowledge and determination. Matthews estimated that he would breach the gates completely within the next 10 minutes, and she still had no clear plan for stopping him that wouldn't create an even worse public relations disaster. Armed response units are in position, Inspector Coleman reported, his voice tight with tension. They're requesting specific rules of engagement regarding use of force against a member of the royal family. The question that Coleman was really asking was one that had never been seriously considered in all the centuries of British constitutional monarchy. What do you do when a prince becomes the threat that the system is designed to defend against? The legal and political implications were staggering, and Matthews knew that any decision she made in the next few minutes could have consequences that would reverberate through the British government for years to come. Tell them to maintain defensive positions only, she replied, knowing that she was essentially allowing Prince Andrew to continue his assault on one of the most symbolically important buildings in the British Isles. No direct intervention unless there's an immediate threat to life. Prince Andrew seemed to sense the hesitation of the authorities around him, and his laughter echoed off the castle walls with a sound that was both triumphant and deeply disturbing. He had found the one scenario where his royal status actually worked to his advantage, creating a paralysis in the security forces that no common criminal could have achieved. You see, he called out, pausing in his cutting operation to address the assembled officers and the cameras above. This is what happens when an institution becomes more concerned with protecting its image than protecting its people. They're so terrified of bad publicity that they'll let me burn through these gates rather than risk the headlines that would come from using force against a prince. The accuracy of his assessment was painful for Matthews to acknowledge. Every instinct she had developed in 32 years of police work was telling her to end this situation immediately. But the political realities of dealing with someone of Prince Andrew's status had created a paralysis that was allowing the crisis to escalate beyond any reasonable bounds. The cutting torch resumed its work, and Matthews could see that Prince Andrew had nearly cut through the main support structure of the gate. Once that gave way, the entire barrier would collapse, providing him with a clear path into the castle grounds. The symbolism would be devastating. A member of the royal family literally burning down the barriers that his own institution had erected. "Ma'am," Sergeant Hayes approached with an urgent update. "We've got confirmation that this is going out live on multiple news channels. Social media is exploding. The palace communications office is in complete crisis mode." Matthews felt a sick certainty that she was presiding over one of the defining moments of 21st century British history. A moment that would be studied and analyzed for generations as either the beginning of a new chapter in the monarchy's evolution or the first crack in a dam that would eventually give way completely. The helicopter above was joined by a second aircraft, and Matthews realized that the media response was escalating as quickly as the security situation. By dawn, this street would be crowded with news crews, photographers, and reporters from around the world, all trying to understand how a senior member of the royal family had been allowed to stage what amounted to a military assault on his own family's home. Prince Andrew's cutting torch finally broke through the main support, and the ornate gate collapsed with a thunderous crash that echoed through the night like the sound of an empire falling. The symbolism was so perfect that Matthews wondered if he had calculated even this detail in advance. Standing in the gap he had created, framed by the twisted remains of metal that had once symbolized the security and permanence of the British monarchy, Prince Andrew raised his cutting torch above his head in a gesture of victory that would undoubtedly become one of the most iconic images of the early 21st century. 43 years of loyal service, he shouted, his voice carrying clearly to the cameras above and the stunned officers surrounding him. This is what it gets you in the House of Windsor. But nobody locks me out of my father's house. Nobody. He began walking through the breach he had created, and Matthews realized that the crisis had just entered its final phase. Once Prince Andrew was actually on the castle grounds, the security implications would multiply exponentially. The armed guards inside the perimeter would be forced to make split-second decisions about how to deal with someone who was simultaneously an intruder and a member of the royal family. "All units, subject has breached the perimeter," she reported into her radio, knowing that these words would trigger protocols that had been developed over decades but never tested in a situation quite like this. He is now on castle grounds. Interior security teams, what is your status? The response was immediate and chilling. Multiple armed units converging on the breach point. Rules of engagement remain unclear. We're in uncharted territory here. Prince Andrew seemed oblivious to the dangers he was walking into, or perhaps he simply didn't care. His movements were steady and purposeful as he advanced across the grounds, the cutting torch still active in his hand, casting eerie shadows across the ancient landscape that had witnessed so much of British history. Matthews made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her career. Abandoning her position outside the perimeter, she followed Prince Andrew through the breach he had created, determined to be present for whatever confrontation was about to unfold. If this situation was going to end badly, she wanted to be in a position to potentially influence the outcome. The castle grounds at night were surprisingly peaceful despite the chaos that had been unfolding at the gates. The ancient trees and carefully maintained gardens seemed to absorb sound, creating an almost sacred quiet that made Prince Andrew's presence feel like a profound violation of something holy. "Your Royal Highness," Matthews called out as she caught up to him, keeping her voice low to avoid attracting the attention of the security teams that she knew were closing in on their position. "You've made your point. You've demonstrated that the barriers couldn't keep you out, but continuing forward is going to force those guards to make decisions that nobody wants them to have to make." Prince Andrew stopped walking and turned to face her, and Matthews was struck by how different he looked now that he had achieved his objective. The manic energy that had driven him through the earlier phases of his assault had been replaced by something that looked almost like peace, as if breaching those gates had satisfied some deep psychological need that had been driving his behavior. "Detective Chief Inspector," he said quietly, his voice lacking the theatrical quality it had carried during his confrontation with the security forces outside the castle. "Do you have children?" The unexpected question caught Matthews off guard. "Yes, sir. 2 daughters. And if they needed you, if they were in trouble or pain or simply needed to feel connected to their family, would any force on earth be able to keep you from reaching them?" Matthews felt her heart break a little as she understood what he was really saying. Underneath all the military equipment and dramatic gestures, Prince Andrew was simply a man who had lost his connection to his family and was desperately trying to find a way back to something that had once given his life meaning. "No, sir," she replied honestly. "Nothing would keep me from my children." Prince Andrew nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he had already known. "Then perhaps you can understand why I had to do this. Not the dramatics, not the spectacle for the cameras, but the simple act of refusing to be locked out of the place that represents everything I've ever cared about." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation, and Matthews turned to see a squad of armed royal protection officers emerging from the darkness of the castle grounds. Their weapons were drawn but held in low-ready positions, and she could see the uncertainty in their faces as they tried to process the unprecedented situation they had been trained for but never expected to encounter. The squad leader, a man Matthews recognized as Chief Inspector Robert Hayes of the Royal Protection Command, approached cautiously, his eyes never leaving Prince Andrew but his voice addressing her.
"DCI Matthews, we need you to step away from the subject immediately."
"This situation is now under the jurisdiction of royal security, and we have protocols that must be followed." Matthews understood that she was being politely but firmly told that her involvement in this incident was over. Whatever happened next would be handled by people with higher security clearances and different rules of engagement than those that govern normal police work. But as she began to step away from Prince Andrew, he suddenly reached out and grasped her arm gently but firmly. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine urgency. "Before this goes any further, before those cameras up there record whatever's about to happen next, I need to say something that needs to be heard." He looked directly up at the hovering helicopters, their searchlights creating a cone of harsh white light that made him appear almost ethereal against the ancient backdrop of the castle. "My name is Andrew Albert Christian Edward, Prince of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland," he began, his voice carrying the formal cadence of official royal pronouncements. "I am the second son of Queen Elizabeth II and the brother of King Charles III, and I want the world to know that everything I have done here tonight was necessary because the institution I have served my entire life had forgotten that its strength comes not from its traditions or its ceremonies, but from its people." He paused, and Matthews could see tears streaming down his face in the harsh glare of the helicopter searchlights. "I served this crown with honor for 43 years. I flew combat missions for this country. I represented the British people around the world with dignity and pride. And when I made mistakes, when I became an embarrassment to the family I love, they didn't try to help me or guide me or support me through the crisis. They simply erased me, as if 4 decades of loyal service could be discarded like yesterday's newspaper." The royal protection officers were clearly struggling with how to respond to what had become less of a security incident and more of a public confession. Prince Andrew wasn't threatening anyone anymore. He was simply standing in his family's garden, speaking directly to the world about the pain of being abandoned by the people he had devoted his life to serving. But I want everyone to understand that my quarrel is not with the British people, not with the institution of monarchy itself, but with the individuals who have allowed fear and political calculation to override the basic human decency that should be at the heart of any family, royal or otherwise. He turned off his cutting torch and set it carefully on the ground, then raised his hand slightly to show that he was no longer armed or threatening. "I'm ready now," he said quietly to Chief Inspector Hayes. "I've said what I needed to say. I've done what I needed to do. Whatever happens next is in your hands." Matthews realized that she had just witnessed something unprecedented in the history of the British monarchy, a member of the royal family publicly challenging the very institution he was part of, not through rebellion or treason, but through a desperate act of love for something that he felt was losing its way. As the royal protection officers moved in to take Prince Andrew into custody, she wondered if this night would be remembered as the moment when the House of Windsor finally faced the reckoning that had been building for decades, or if it would simply be written off as the breakdown of one troubled man who couldn't accept the consequences of his own actions. Either way, she knew that the image of Prince Andrew standing in that cone of white light, tears streaming down his face as he confessed his love for an institution that had rejected him, would become one of the defining moments of the modern British monarchy. Whether that moment represented a beginning or an ending remained to be seen.